Alright, so I never thought I'd be sharing something like this. But after everything that happened, I just feel like I have to. It still doesn't make much sense to me, but maybe writing it down will help me sort things out. I'm not really much of a storyteller, so I'll just tell it how it happened. So this all started last year, right before Halloween. My neighbors and I decided to do something fun together. We'd all been living in the same suburban neighborhood for years, but most of us didn't really hang out much beyond the occasional wave or small talk. I live next door to a couple, Sarah and Jake, and across the street are two other families. There's this one house at the end of the block that's been abandoned for as long as I can remember. It's not a haunted house or anything, just old and run down with boarded up windows and an overgrown yard. No one really pays attention to it. But for Halloween, someone had the bright idea to check it out, for fun. It was Jake's idea, if I remember right. He's the kind of guy that's always pushing for something to happen, something exciting. And Sarah, his wife, was all for it. They got everyone else on board pretty quick. There was a bit of a buzz around the neighborhood that week because, well, it wasn't like we had a lot going on. The kids were excited for trick-or-treating, the parents were planning parties. But for us, a bunch of adults with nothing better to do, the idea of checking out the creepy old house sounded like a good way to break the routine. Honestly, I was skeptical at first. I'm not really into that kind of thing, but they insisted it would be fun, like some sort of adventure. We planned to go over there the night before Halloween, just to get into the spirit. It was supposed to be harmless, like urban exploring or whatever. We figured we'd walk around, check it out, and then probably head back to Jake and Sarah's for a few drinks. It all seemed pretty innocent at the time. So, Halloween Eve rolls around, and we all gather at Jake and Sarah's place. There were about 8 of us total. Besides me, Jake, and Sarah, there was Tom and his girlfriend Lisa, who live a couple of doors down, and another guy named Mike, who recently moved into the neighborhood. We didn't know Mike too well, but he seemed all right. He'd heard us talking about the abandoned house and asked if he could tag along, and we didn't see a reason to say no. The night felt weird, though. There was this chill in the air that I couldn't shake. It's hard to explain, but there was something off. Everyone was in a good mood, laughing and joking, but the closer we got to the house, the more uneasy I started to feel. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to come off as the buzzkill. Plus, it was probably just nerves. I mean, how often do you walk into an old, decaying house with a bunch of people? We made our way down the street, the abandoned house looming in the distance. It looked worse up close, honestly. The yard was a jungle of weeds and broken branches, and the house itself was just sad. The windows were either shattered or boarded up, and the door was hanging on by one rusty hinge. There was graffiti all over the place, and someone had tossed a couple of old tires in the front yard. It wasn't exactly spooky, just run down. Jake was the first to walk up to the door, of course, and we all followed him. It was surprisingly easy to push the door open, even with it hanging the way it was. I guess I expected it to be locked or something. When we stepped inside, the smell hit us right away. Stale air, mildew, and dust. It was dark, too, even though the sun hadn't fully set yet. The house felt heavy, like the walls were holding on to something. At first, it was kind of exciting. We were all laughing, making dumb jokes about the place, pretending like we weren't creeped out. Jake started poking around, looking through old drawers and cabinets, trying to see if anyone had left anything behind. But the place had clearly been empty for a long time. There wasn't much to find, just some broken furniture, a few scraps of old newspapers, and a bunch of junk. But after a while, the mood started to change. It was subtle at first, just a shift in the way we were talking. Everyone's voices got quieter, and we stopped making jokes. I think we all realized, without saying it, that the house wasn't exactly a fun place to be. There was something about it that felt off. Like, yeah, it was just an old house, but being in there didn't feel right. Then weird stuff started happening. Nothing major at first, just little things that, on their own, wouldn't have meant anything. I remember Lisa complaining that she felt like someone was watching her. We all laughed it off, but I gotta admit I felt it too. Like there were eyes on us. Even though the house was completely empty. Every now and then, we'd hear what sounded like footsteps upstairs, but when we'd go check, there was no one there. We blamed it on animals, like maybe a raccoon or something had gotten in, but it didn't sit right with me. After about half an hour of walking around, Jake suggested we split up and explore different parts of the house. At the time, it seemed like a good idea. We'd cover more ground that way. But looking back, I wish we hadn't done that. I should have said something, but I didn't. We broke into smaller groups. Jake and Sarah went upstairs. Mike and I stayed on the ground floor, and Tom and Lisa decided to check out the basement. It was dark by then, and none of us had brought flashlights, so we were relying on the weak light from our phones. The whole place felt even more claustrophobic in the dark. We started poking around, but it wasn't long before things took a turn for the worse. So Mike and I stayed on the main floor, like I said. We didn't really have much of a plan, just kind of wandering around, checking out random rooms. There wasn't much to see, just empty spaces filled with dust and debris. The walls were cracked, and the floors creaked with every step. The whole place felt like it could fall apart at any second. I kept glancing at the door, wondering if it'd be better to just leave and call it a night. But Mike seemed pretty into it, so I figured I'd stick it out a little longer. We walked into what looked like an old dining room, and that's when things started to get weird. There was a big old table in the center covered in dust and something else. At first, I thought it was just dirt, but when I looked closer, it was sticky, like fresh. Mike was the one who noticed it first, and he crouched down to get a better look. "Is this blood?" he asked, half joking, but there was this edge to his voice that made me think he wasn't entirely kidding. I knelt down next to him and touched it. It was dark, not quite red, but definitely wet. I tried to laugh it off, said it was probably just some old paint or something, but I didn't really believe it. It didn't look like paint. We both kind of stood there for a second, staring at it, when we heard something from upstairs, a loud crash, followed by what sounded like footsteps. Mike and I looked at each other, and without saying anything, we rushed toward the staircase. I thought maybe Jake and Sarah had found something, maybe knocked something over, but as soon as we got to the bottom of the stairs, I knew something wasn't right. There was this strange noise coming from upstairs. At first, I couldn't make out what it was, but as we listened, it sounded like whispering. Faint, but definitely there. It was so quiet that I couldn't even be sure if I was really hearing it or just imagining it. Mike looked up at the ceiling, and I could see him trying to figure out the same thing. He opened his mouth to say something, but before he could, we heard Sarah scream. It wasn't a playful scream either. It was sharp, panicked, and it cut through the house like a knife. Mike and I bolted up the stairs, calling out to Jake and Sarah, but they didn't answer. We reached the top, and I swear, the air felt heavier up there like it was pressing down on us. There was this awful smell too, like something rotten. It was faint, but enough to make me gag. We started opening doors, looking for them. The first couple of rooms were empty, just more broken furniture and junk. But when we got to the last room at the end of the hall, the door was closed. I reached for the handle, and just as I was about to open it, Jake burst out, nearly knocking me over. He looked wild, eyes wide, breathing heavy like he'd been running. "Where's Sarah?" Mike asked, but Jake didn't answer right away. He just stood there, staring at us like he couldn't understand the question. She's gone," Jake finally said. His voice was low, shaking. I didn't know what he meant at first. Gone? Like she left? We were looking around, and then I turned around, and she was just gone. We pushed past him into the room, but it was completely empty. No sign of Sarah. No sign of anyone. Just a dusty old bed frame and a pile of trash in the corner. Mike and I exchanged a look, and I could tell he was as freaked out as I was, but we tried to stay calm. "She's probably just messing with you," I said, though I didn't believe it. Jake shook his head, his face pale. "No, man. You don't get it. She's gone." I looked everywhere. We searched the whole upstairs after that, calling her name, checking every room, every closet. Nothing. She was nowhere. By then, we were all starting to panic. Sarah wasn't the kind of person to just disappear like that, especially not in a place like this. Jake kept pacing back and forth, mumbling to himself, while Mike and I tried to figure out what to do next. That's when we heard footsteps again, but this time, they weren't upstairs. They were coming from below us. The basement. Mike and I looked at each other, and without even saying a word, we both knew what we had to do. Tom and Lisa had gone down there earlier, and we hadn't heard from them since. I didn't want to go down there, but we couldn't just leave them. We made our way back down the stairs, and that's when we noticed something weird. The front door, the one we had come through, was wide open. I was sure we had closed it when we came in, but now it was just hanging there. Jake started toward it like he was ready to leave, but Mike grabbed his arm. "We can't go yet. We need to find Sarah," he said. Jake didn't argue, but he didn't look too convinced either. The three of us stood at the top of the basement stairs, listening. At first, it was quiet. Too quiet. I could barely make out the faint sounds of the Halloween festivities going on outside. Kids laughing, people talking, but it all felt so far away. Like we were in another world, cut off from everything. Then we heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from deep within the basement. I didn't want to go down there. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get out of that house, but we didn't have a choice. Sarah, Tom, and Lisa were down there, or at least we thought they were. Mike was the first to start down the stairs, and I followed right behind him. Jake came last, moving slower than the rest of us. The basement was cold, colder than the rest of the house. It smelled worse too, like damp earth and something else, something metallic. The light from our phones barely cut through the darkness, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. The further down we went, the worse it got. It felt like the air was getting thicker, harder to breathe. When we reached the bottom, we found Tom. He was standing in the middle of the room, just staring. He didn't even turn around when we called his name. His back was to us, and I could see his shoulders rising and falling like he was breathing hard. Tom! Mike called again, but there was no answer. Just silence. I've never been so freaked out in my life. Tom was just standing there, completely still, like he didn't even hear us. Mike called his name again, louder this time, but Tom didn't react. We moved closer, and that's when I noticed something off. His clothes were dirty, covered in dust, and something else. His hands were hanging by his sides, palms open, but they looked wet, like he'd dipped them in something. I thought about the sticky stuff we found upstairs and felt my stomach twist. I glanced at Mike, and I could tell he was thinking the same thing. Tom, what the hell are you doing? I finally said, my voice shaking. But again, no response. It was like he wasn't even there, like he was somewhere else. Jake, who had been hanging back, finally stepped forward. Tom, man, are you all right? He asked, sounding more concerned than scared. He reached out and put a hand on Tom's shoulder. That's when Tom finally moved. He didn't turn to look at us, but he took this slow, shuffling step forward, almost like he was in a trance. Mike moved around him to get a better look at his face, and that's when he gasped. Dude, what happened to you? Mike's voice cracked a little, and that set me on edge even more. I walked around to where Mike was standing, and when I saw Tom's face, I felt the blood drain out of mine. Tom's eyes were wide open, staring straight ahead, but they weren't focusing on anything. His pupils were huge, almost black, and there was this weird, glazed-over look in them. He didn't seem to recognize us at all. His face was pale, his skin slick with sweat, and his mouth hung slightly open, like he was in some kind of shock. But the worst part was the blood. There was dried blood smeared around his mouth, down his chin, and splattered on his shirt. I couldn't tell if it was his or someone else's. What the hell, man? Jake muttered, stepping back. Tom, can you hear us? Mike asked again, trying to keep his voice steady, but it was no use. Tom just kept staring, his breathing shallow and ragged. I reached out to touch his arm, trying to snap him out of whatever state he was in, but as soon as I made contact, he jerked away from me like I'd shocked him. He took a few more slow steps forward, still staring into nothing. Where's Lisa? I asked, not really expecting an answer. I don't know why, but I was starting to feel like we wouldn't find her. Not the way we were expecting. Anyway, Mike, trying to keep it together, looked around the basement. It was a lot bigger than I thought it would be, with a few smaller rooms branching off from the main area. The walls were made of cold, cracked concrete, and the floor was littered with broken furniture and debris. There was barely any light, just the weak beams from our phones. Jake started to move toward one of the side rooms, probably looking for Lisa, when we heard another noise. This one was different from the footsteps we'd heard earlier. It was a low, dragging sound like something being pulled across the floor. It was coming from one of the dark corners, the farthest one from where we were standing. My heart started pounding in my ears, and I could see Mike tense up too. Do you hear that? Jake whispered. We all froze, listening. The dragging sound continued for a few more seconds, then stopped. There was a moment of silence, and then we heard something else breathing. Deep, labored breathing, like someone was struggling to catch their breath. Mike aimed his phone's flashlight in the direction of the sound, but the beam barely cut through the darkness. Lisa, he called out, his voice shaky. No answer. I swallowed hard. trying to ignore the knot forming in my stomach. We moved closer, cautiously, the sound of our footsteps echoing off the walls. As we got closer to the corner, the dragging sound started again, followed by more of that awful breathing. Finally, we reached the far end of the room, and that's when we saw it, or rather saw her. Lisa was lying on the floor, half propped up against the wall, her head slumped forward. Her clothes were torn, and her hair was matted with dirt. There was a huge gash on her forehead, dried blood crusted over it. She was breathing, but it was shallow, and her chest rose and fell in these short, quick bursts. For a moment, none of us moved. I think we were all just trying to process what we were seeing. "Lisa!" Mike rushed over to her, kneeling beside her. He gently lifted her head, trying to get her to respond. "Lisa, can you hear me? What happened?" She blinked slowly, like she was struggling to focus, but she didn't say anything. Jake and I exchanged a look, and I could tell we were both thinking the same thing. What the hell had happened down here? As Mike tried to help her sit up, Lisa finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't an accident," she mumbled. Her words were slurred, like she was having trouble forming them. Mike leaned in closer, trying to understand her. "What do you mean?" "What wasn't an accident?" he asked, panic rising in his voice. Lisa's eyes flickered open, and for a brief second, they locked on Tom, who was still standing a few feet away, staring blankly at the wall. She opened her mouth to speak again, but before she could get the words out, her body went limp, and she slumped forward. Mike let out a strangled cry, shaking her shoulders, trying to wake her up. But she didn't move. "Lisa! Lisa, wake up!" Mike was on the verge of tears, and I could feel the panic bubbling up inside me, too. Jake knelt down next to her, checking her pulse, but he just shook his head. "She's breathing, but barely," he muttered, his voice tight. "We need to get her out of here. Now!" That's when Tom finally spoke. His voice was low, almost a whisper, and it sent chills down my spine. "She didn't fall," he said, his words slow and deliberate. We all froze and turned to look at him. He hadn't moved from his spot, still standing there like a statue, his face pale and emotionless. "She didn't fall down the stairs. She was pushed." "What?" Mike stammered, still cradling Lisa's limp body. "What the hell are you talking about?" Tom slowly turned to face us, his eyes wide and unfocused. "I saw it. I saw someone push her. But it wasn't," he trailed off, his voice breaking. "It wasn't any of us." A cold wave of dread washed over me. None of us wanted to believe what he was saying, but there was something in Tom's voice that made it hard to dismiss. He wasn't just scared, he was sure. Sure that something or someone had hurt Lisa. The air felt like it had been sucked out of the room after Tom said that. My stomach was twisted in knots, and I couldn't think straight. Jake and Mike were looking at each other, trying to figure out what to say or do, but I knew they were just as freaked out as I was. The idea that someone had pushed Lisa, that someone else might be in the house with us, made my skin crawl. But then Tom said something that made everything worse. "It was Sarah." At first, I thought I heard him wrong. "What?" Mike asked, looking at Tom like he'd lost his mind. "What are you talking about?" "Sarah's missing, man. We've been looking for her." Tom's eyes finally focused on Mike, but there was something wrong in his expression. It was like he was looking through him, not at him. "I saw her," he said again, his voice shaking but determined. "When I was downstairs, I saw Sarah. She was standing at the top of the stairs, and she pushed Lisa. I swear it was her." Jake stepped forward, his face pale. "Dude, stop. You're not making sense. Sarah wouldn't, she couldn't, do something like that." But Tom just shook his head, like he knew something we didn't. "It was her. She looked different, but it was her." "What do you mean different?" I asked, my voice barely steady. I didn't want to hear the answer, but I had to know what Tom was getting at. "She wasn't acting right," Tom muttered, rubbing his hands together nervously. "When I saw her, she didn't say anything. She just stared at me. Her eyes, they were empty, like she didn't even know me. And then she was gone. But I know it was her. I swear it." Mike stood up, shaking his head. "No, man, that doesn't make sense. Sarah's not here. We've been searching the house, and she's gone. You're probably just freaked out seeing things. I mean, look at this place. It's messing with all of us." I wanted to agree with Mike, But the look on Tom's face, the sheer certainty of what he was saying, was making me doubt everything. He wasn't just scared, he was convinced. And as crazy as it sounded, I couldn't shake the feeling that something really was wrong with Sarah. We all stood there for a moment, no one knowing what to say. The silence was suffocating. I could hear Lisa's shallow breathing, but it was getting weaker, and Mike was getting more frantic by the second. "We need to get her out of here," he said again, more urgently this time. "She needs help." We decided to head for the front door. We'd figure out what to do about Sarah later, but right now, Lisa needed medical attention. Mike and Jake lifted her up between them, trying to be as gentle as possible, while I grabbed my phone and led the way toward the stairs. Tom followed us, his footsteps slow and hesitant, like he didn't want to leave the basement. As we reached the stairs, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow, moving just beyond the light from my phone. I stopped, heart racing, and turned to look, but there was nothing there. Just the empty basement. But I could have sworn I saw something, someone. My skin prickled with that same sense of being watched, the same unease that had been with me all night. "Hurry up," Mike called from the stairs. "We need to get Lisa out of here." I tore my eyes away from the dark corner and followed them up, pushing the weird feeling down. It was just nerves, I told myself. This place was creepy as hell, and my mind was playing tricks on me. We reached the main floor, and I could see the front door still open, letting in the faint sounds of Halloween night outside. It was like a lifeline, something normal in the middle of all this chaos. I breathed a sigh of relief, ready to get out of this nightmare of a house. But just as we were about to step outside, we heard a voice. Soft, almost a whisper, but it stopped us all in our tracks. "Where are you going?" I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. The voice was coming from the hallway, to our left, just out of sight. It was familiar. Too familiar. It was Sarah. Jake's face went white, and Mike dropped Lisa's arm in shock, nearly stumbling back. "Sarah," he called, his voice shaking. "Is that you?" There was no response, just the faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer. I couldn't move. None of us could. We were all staring at the hallway, waiting, dreading what we were about to see. And then she stepped into view. It was Sarah, but not. She was wearing the same clothes she'd been wearing when we first entered the house, but her face, it wasn't right. Her skin was pale, almost gray, and her eyes, they were hollow, lifeless. Just like Tom had said, she looked straight at us, but there was no recognition in her gaze. No emotion, just this blank, empty stare that sent chills down my spine. "Sarah," Jake whispered again, taking a hesitant step forward. "What happened to you? We've been looking for you." She didn't answer. She just kept staring, her eyes flicking from Jake to Mike to me, like she was sizing us up. And then, slowly, a smile crept across her face. But it wasn't a normal smile. It was twisted, like someone trying to imitate a smile, but getting it all wrong. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice flat and cold. The room felt like it was closing in on us. Mike stepped back, pulling Jake with him. "Sarah, we need to leave. Lisa's hurt. We need to get her to a hospital." But Sarah didn't move. She just kept standing there, blocking our path to the door, her smile growing wider. "You can't leave," she whispered. "Not yet." Tom, who had been silent this whole time, suddenly spoke up, his voice hoarse and trembling. "That's not Sarah," he said, backing away slowly. "That's not her." I didn't know what to believe. Part of me wanted to grab Lisa and bolt for the door, but another part of me, the part that was staring at Sarah and feeling the hair on the back of my neck stand up, knew that Tom was right. This wasn't the Sarah we knew. This was something else, something wrong. Suddenly, Sarah took a step toward us, her movements jerky, unnatural. "You should have stayed away," she said, her voice growing louder, more forceful. Now it's too late. Before any of us could react, Sarah lunged at Jake, grabbing him by the arm. He yelped in shock, trying to pull away, but her grip was like iron. Mike jumped forward, trying to pry her off, but she was strong, way stronger than she should have been. She twisted Jake's arm, and he screamed in pain, collapsing to the floor. I rushed forward, trying to help, but Sarah turned her head toward me, her eyes locking onto mine. For a split second, I felt frozen, like I couldn't move, couldn't think. All I could see were her eyes, dark, empty, and full of something I couldn't understand. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Sarah let go of Jake, who scrambled backward, clutching his arm. She stepped back, her head tilting to the side like she was considering something. "You don't belong here," she whispered one last time, before turning and walking back into the shadows of the house, disappearing from sight. The silence that followed was unbearable. None of us moved. None of us spoke. All I could hear was Jake's labored breathing and the faint sounds of Halloween outside. "What the hell just happened?" Mike finally whispered, his voice barely audible. But none of us had an answer. We were all frozen for what felt like forever after Sarah disappeared into the dark hallway. The tension in the air was suffocating. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything, but nothing added up. 1 second Sarah was gone, and now she was back, but it wasn't really her. It couldn't be. Lisa groaned softly, her breathing getting worse. "We have to go," I said, my voice shaking. "We need to get her out of here." Mike and Jake were still in shock. Jake was clutching his arm where Sarah had grabbed him, his face pale and full of disbelief. Mike just stared into the hallway where Sarah had vanished, like he couldn't comprehend what he'd just seen. But we didn't have time to figure it out. Lisa was fading fast. I moved toward the door, trying to push it open wider, but something stopped me literally. The door wouldn't budge. It was like it was stuck in place, as if the house itself didn't want us to leave. I pushed harder, putting all my weight into it, but it didn't move an inch. "Guys, help me!" I shouted, trying to shake them out of their daze. Mike and Jake finally snapped back to reality, and they rushed over to help. The three of us shoved at the door together, but it still wouldn't move. It felt like we were trapped. Suddenly, we heard footsteps upstairs. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving from one end of the house to the other. My heart sank. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. I turned my head toward the staircase, and there, standing at the top, was Sarah again. Her figure was just barely visible in the dim light, but we could all feel her presence. "You're not leaving," she said, her voice echoing through the house. This time it was different, stronger, more commanding. It sent chills down my spine. Mike grabbed a chair and tried smashing the window next to the door, desperate to find a way out. The glass cracked, but didn't shatter. "This isn't happening," he kept muttering under his breath. "This can't be happening." Jake, looking panicked, glanced around for another escape route. "We need to get to the back door," he said, his voice strained. "Come on, let's move." Without waiting, we lifted Lisa again, struggling to carry her toward the back of the house. I could hear the footsteps upstairs growing louder, like Sarah was following us from room to room, staying just out of sight. I felt like we were being hunted. As we reached the kitchen, Mike tried the back door, but it was the same as the front, stuck completely immovable. Panic started setting in. We were running out of options, and I could feel time slipping away. Then, out of nowhere, Tom spoke up again. "She's not going to let us leave until we give her what she wants." We all turned to look at him. He was standing in the middle of the room, his face pale, his hands trembling. "What do you mean?" Jake asked, his voice tight with fear. Tom swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the room. "I don't know exactly, but it's like she's not going to stop until she finishes whatever she started. It's not just about us. There's something more. She's not here for us." "What the hell are you talking about, Tom?" Mike demanded, his patience running thin. "She attacked Jake. She's keeping us trapped in this house. And you're saying it's not about us?" Tom nodded, his face pale and sweaty. "It's Lisa," he said quietly. "She's here for Lisa." A heavy silence fell over the room. None of us wanted to believe it, but it made a twisted kind of sense. Lisa had been the one who went missing first, the one who was hurt. And Sarah, if it really was her, had been fixated on Lisa from the start. I didn't know why, but there was something about Lisa that had drawn Sarah's attention. "What do we do?" Jake asked, his voice barely a whisper. Tom looked at Lisa, then back at us. "We have to take her back downstairs," he said. "That's where it all started. Maybe that's where it has to end." Mike and Jake exchanged uneasy glances, but I knew they were thinking the same thing. We didn't have many options. If we stayed here, we were sitting ducks. And if we left Lisa behind, none of us would ever forgive ourselves. "Let's go," I said, taking a deep breath. We're not leaving without her. We carried Lisa back to the basement, every step feeling heavier than the last. The air grew colder as we descended, and the familiar smell of dust and damp concrete hit me again. This time, though, it felt even worse, like the walls were closing in on us. When we reached the bottom, we laid Lisa down gently on the floor. Her breathing was shallow, and her face was pale. I wasn't sure how much longer she could hold on. "What now?" Mike asked, looking around the basement like he was expecting something to happen. Tom didn't answer. Instead, he walked over to the far corner, the same one where we had first found Lisa, and knelt down. He started feeling along the floor, his hands brushing against the cold concrete. "There's something here," he muttered. "What are you talking about?" Jake asked, his voice strained. Tom didn't respond. He kept feeling around until his fingers found a crack in the floor. He pried at it, his hands shaking, and after a few moments, a small section of the floor lifted up. Beneath it was a narrow, dark hole, just big enough to fit a person. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. "What the hell is that?" I asked, my voice barely steady. Tom stood up, his face pale. "This is where she's been," he whispered. "This is where she took Sarah." Before any of us could react, we heard footsteps again, this time from directly above us. The sound was slow, deliberate, and getting closer. I looked up, my heart pounding. The footsteps were coming down the stairs. Sarah was coming. "Do we leave Lisa?" Mike asked, panic clear in his voice. "No," I snapped. "We stay. We finish this." The footsteps grew louder, echoing off the concrete walls. The door at the top of the stairs creaked open, and Sarah's figure appeared, her pale face glowing in the dim light. She didn't say anything this time. She just stared down at us with those cold, empty eyes. Tom stepped forward, standing between Sarah and Lisa. "You can't have her," he said, his voice shaking but firm. Sarah tilted her head, her eyes narrowing. "She's already mine," she whispered. Without warning, she lunged at Tom, moving faster than any of us could react. Tom stumbled back, falling to the ground as Sarah's hands reached out for him. But before she could grab him, Lisa, who had been lying motionless, suddenly sat up, gasping for breath. "Sarah, stop!" Lisa's voice was weak but clear. Sarah froze, her hands inches away from Tom's throat. She turned her head slowly toward Lisa, her expression unreadable. For a moment, everything was still. The air was heavy, like the house itself was holding its breath. And then, without another word, Sarah stepped back, her figure fading into the shadows. The house creaked and groaned like it was releasing some kind of tension, and just like that, she was gone. The door at the top of the stairs swung open wider, letting in the sounds of the outside world. The front door had finally unlocked. We carried Lisa out of the house as fast as we could, our breaths shaky and hearts pounding. By the time we reached the street, it felt like we'd escaped a nightmare. But as we laid Lisa down on the grass and called for help, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us. In the days that followed, we all tried to piece together what had happened. Lisa recovered, though she never spoke about that night, and Tom moved away without a word. The house remained abandoned, a dark spot on an otherwise normal street. But sometimes when I walk by it, I swear I can still feel eyes on me just out of sight.